Hey guys, welcome back to the My Sugar Free Journey podcast. We got an excellent episode for you today. Today we are joined by Dr. Sarah Ballantyne, and you might know her as the author behind thepaleomom.com. She has a fantastic podcast, which I listen to fairly regularly, the Paleo View podcast. She is the author of the New York Times bestselling author of 3 books, The Paleo Approach, which is probably the first thing I ever read of hers. In fact, I think that's probably how I was introduced to her website. The Paleo Approach Cookbook and The Healing Kitchen. She has a PhD in medical biophysics and a host of other cool things about her that we'll get into in the episode. So, Dr. Ballantyne, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, I appreciate you coming on because you're definitely somebody that I've been meaning to talk to for a while. Sometimes I've got a list on my computer of like 200 people I want to talk to, and sometimes it's hard to go down the list and find the people that find the contact information and everything else. It's a job, but I appreciate you coming on.
Oh, I love what we're going to talk about today. I love this opportunity, and thank you again.
All right, so let's get into your background a little bit. What is a PhD in medical biophysics?
So one of the things that's really interesting right now about sciences is the lines between different fields are blurring. And most now, like, scientists can't necessarily put themselves into one category. Like, it used to be biology, physics, chemistry, astronomy, right? Like, and it was just one of those 4 buckets. And what's happening now is that, whether it's the tools of a physicist that are being applied in a biology lab, or the chemistry that is being explored within the cell, right? So what's happening is those lines are blurring, and you're starting to see, right, there's some older multidisciplinary scientific fields like biochemistry, which will be a fairly familiar term for a lot of people. Medical biophysics is the combination of biology, chemistry, and physics with medical application. And so it really is searching for a term to try to explain this field of science that's kind of in between everything else. And different colleges will call that something different. So sometimes that type of research would fall under a bioengineering category. Sometimes it would fall under straight biophysics. So it's one of those sort of catch-all phrases for, we don't really fit into any of these like traditional sciences anymore.
Okay. So what made you want to take that route?
Wow, that's a super deep question. I wanted to be a medical researcher at age 7. And that was largely inspired by the fact that my grandfather was a cancer researcher and had actually been hired to establish 2 different medical schools in Canada. He was the head of the National Cancer Research Institute in Canada for a number of years. And some of my
did he write a book?
Did he
write a book?
No.
Okay.
He did, but he wrote gardening books. So his books.
Okay. Well, the reason why I asked is I was at the Half Price bookstore the other day, and I saw a Ballantyne, but it wasn't your name, and it was a book on cancer, and I thought, well, I wonder if there's a relation.
Yeah. Ballantyne's my married name, so my grandfather was McCarter.
Okay.
And he actually did some really interesting work for the Department of Defense in Canada that, when it hit its 50 years, got reclassified. So I don't know what he did. He used to joke that, like, I could tell you what I do, but then I'd have to kill you. And like, it was just this like urban legend, but like family lore type thing. But some of my earliest memories were of helping him in his lab, being maybe 2 years old and lifted on top of a lab stool and being told to move the mice with these giant tumors on their back from the dirty cage into the clean cage. And fortunately, they were very docile mice and I didn't get bitten, so I wasn't scarred for life out of that experience. And so I think that was a really, had a really big impact on me. my mom says that even as a very, very young child, when you would ask me what I wanted to do with my life, I would say something important. I think I've always been really attracted to careers that have a very altruistic mission. So, expanding human knowledge in scientific research I think, falls under that banner. And then I really stuck with wanting to do research, but which exact field interested me the most kind of shifted over time. I ended up doing my bachelor's degree in physics, and taking all of the electives that were sort of biophysics. I did my honors thesis in the Cancer Research Institute, looking at radiation treatment plans. And physics also has this sort of wide range of subfields. And I kept finding myself more and more attracted to the medical side. So when I was accepted to it was one of those weird things, because I don't think I had very high confidence levels in those days, but I got accepted to every graduate program that I applied for with full scholarships. And I wasn't anticipating that. I applied to 7 different colleges, thinking that my backup, with backup plans, and I wasn't anticipating being sought after as a 21-year-old. But I was. And as I was touring those colleges and meeting all the potential supervisors and meeting all of these departments, again, I sort of found myself like, it's the medical stuff. And I ended up choosing the most biology-focused lab out of I probably toured 50 labs over a 3-week period, trying to decide where I would go to grad school. And I ended up, almost a pure physiology project that fell under a medical biophysics banner because of the tools that were being used to make measurements, and ended up having to completely teach myself all of the basic biology, anatomy, physiology required for that research. So I spent the first 6 months of my PhD program just reading textbooks, and I used to read papers with a medical dictionary beside me. But I was really attracted to the idea of understanding what's happening in the body and what the body does to protect itself. So my PhD was really focused on understanding this antioxidant and anti-inflammatory system in the body that under normal conditions helps to sort of control the immune system. But I was under the sort of banner of critical care medicine at that time. In that situation where there's such a huge stimulus to the immune system to turn on inflammation, this system is inadequate. And, my research was really focused on, like, how can we manipulate the system to utilize what the body's already doing to make it more effective in these disease states. And that's really interesting as I look back now, because I take a very similar approach, but trying to understand where nutrition fits into that. How does nutrition support that system so it can be more efficacious at reining in the immune system in these times of critical illness? And what can we do in terms of lifestyle to support what the body's already doing to try to restrain the immune system? So I've ended up doing this, just really a slight shift in terms of the focus. Instead of looking at, well, how can I manipulate the system with a drug or gene therapy or, all of the other things that I was sort of exploring in my PhD and my research after I graduated from graduate school, but now trying to apply it to a day-to-day life. Like what are the things that help to support not just this system, but all of our protective systems in our body? What can I do on a day-to-day basis so that if I am in that car accident, my antioxidant, anti-inflammatory systems are so well supported that I don't trigger that inflammation gone wild type event. And that applies to sort of acute, injury. It applies to chronic illness. It applies to autoimmune disease. And it's been for me a really interesting journey, because my journey from researcher to health educator was really driven by my personal health challenges through all of that education.
Right.
But I get to now use that education in a way that feels even more important. Like it's even better than expanding human knowledge, because it's taking all of these, tens of thousands of researchers all over the world who are doing that and actually making their research relevant to the average person and being that bridge between academic research and the person who just wants to feel better. And there's not very many people who do that job. So it's a real privilege to be able to be that like science translator.
That, I think that's crucial, because so much of the science that I had to learn in the early days of me trying to figure out my diet was behind a wall of scientific gibberish. I mean, to me, I wasn't a trained scientist, and thank God that there are resources now. There's way more resources now than there were 5 years ago.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah, to help people understand that. I mean, it was challenging.
I think there's also a hunger for it now that didn't exist 5 to 10 years ago. I think that the average sort of media consumer now is so jaded from, being burned so many times of trusting this guru, right? This person, and then realizing that information is complete BS, that it's actually harming them, that they wasted their time going down the wrong path, or they made things even worse by following these uninformed recommendations. That the natural response to that is to become a more educated consumer. And this is obviously in health conscious communities, but also beyond that. If I'm buying something online now, I might research that thing. I will read so many different reviews now and articles and comparison shop. It's just become a different landscape with the internet that we just have to navigate it with so much more sort of intention and information gathering in order to really be able to use it still in a positive way.
And sometimes the worst thing that can happen to someone is they get the wrong idea first. Mm-hmm. I mean, I deal with so many people that, they were vegans for 5 years, or, so something that they were doing that made issues worse, but they were it took so much time and effort to unconvince them of the wrong idea before they could even begin to look at the right idea. And so I think that's why it's crucial to get the right, the good ideas, the right ideas out there as widely as possible, because you just don't know who's listening.
I agree completely.
You don't know what you're going to affect, what you're going to do for someone out there. The number of people I talked to who were vegans for 6 months and just, or a year or 2 years, and it just made matters worse is shocking. But how did you go from all of that, which is awesome? How did you find, paleo as the diet that reduced inflammation, that did so many good things for you?
Yeah, it's interesting because somebody made an observation in my life the other day of, your website's called The Paleo Mom, and you talk at all these paleo conferences, and you're sort of like a leader in the paleo movement. And yet, if I ask you how you eat, you never use the word paleo to describe how you eat. And it's an interesting branding challenge for me. To the beginning of the story and the end of the story together. I was morbidly obese. I had over a dozen different diagnosed health conditions. I was borderline type 2 diabetic. I have 4 autoimmune diseases. I was having migraines, and I have fibromyalgia, so I was in pain all the time. I had a whole pile of different gastrointestinal things going on that I will spare the details, and a lot of skin things going on. So it was, I was just miserable. And I ended up, when my first daughter was born, I was in a postdoctoral research position and working on transitioning into running my own lab. And she had colic and at best would sleep 45 minutes at a time. And I was so sick already. Like, I could do sick and this high profile academic career, or I could do sick and motherhood, but I couldn't do all three. And I really just had to tap out. And fortunately, there's a program run by the National Institutes of Health in America that provide what are called reentry grants for women who take time off there's a criteria to make you qualify. You have to have reached a certain level of education experience to qualify, which I did, but not a criteria on why you take time off, which is, I think, really, really neat. And then they help you re-enter. You can take up to 8 years off. And so I decided that I would take advantage of this program and just work on being a mom right now. And I would go back later. When I hit my 8 years, 2 years ago, I realized that what I'm doing now is more important, and decided that this was the path that I really wanted to continue on. But I was really sick, and I ended up losing 100 pounds on a low carb diet, which was great because I had 100 pounds, I had more than 100 pounds to lose, but it actually made most of my health conditions worse. It sort of normalized my blood sugar, reduced my blood pressure, but my skin was worse, and my GI symptoms were worse, and my migraines were more frequent, and my energy level was worse. My joint pain was worse. And it was that frustration of, but I did this really hard thing that all my doctors have told me, oh, and you got to lose weight, right? Like I've been told for most of my life, you got to lose weight. Like you're not healthy because you're overweight. And I really believed that if I just lost the weight, my life would be magical sunshine and unicorns and rainbows. And it didn't pan out that way. I had worked very, very hard over a year to lose all that weight in between my two daughters. And I was struggling. I felt even more. And despite the fact that, I'd given up this thing to try to achieve better balance and be able to prioritize my own health. And so I hit a real low the summer that my second daughter was 1.5 years, where I was, the thinnest I'd ever been. I was doing yoga classes and doing, I was active. I felt like on paper, I'm doing everything right. And I was battling some fairly severe depression and anxiety, quite a lot of pain. My GI symptoms were terrible. I had asthma and allergies and migraines, and my skin was absolute wreck because I have psoriasis and lichen planus, which are two autoimmune skin conditions. But I also had really bad acne and eczema, which are just inflammatory conditions. And it felt to me like I had traded this one very visible sign of being unhealthy, of being overweight, for just a different, very visible sign of being unhealthy, which was my skin being just in such bad shape. And I ended up turning to Dr. Google, which is what a lot of people do. But I was really looking for answers for my skin, and it ended up sort of opening a can of worms. I found an article about lichen planus and the paleo diet that had some scientific references in it. And then I started getting into the science and basically using all of my training in how to dig into the scientific literature and, read studies and be able to combine results from different places to form this bigger picture. And I basically applied my scientific background to the problem of my own health. And that started with the paleo diet, which when I first read about it, I thought it sounded completely crazy. I was like, there's no way I'm not eating any of these foods, even though I was coming at that point from low carb. But the science was my hook, and I kept reading more about it. And over about 3 months, I decided that I really needed to try it. And then I was one of those jerks who had like the miraculous healing experience. In 2 weeks, I went off all 6 prescription medications that I was on at the time. Over the first 2 months, I lost 20 additional pounds, which I hadn't really thought I'd be able to lose at that point. I've never had a migraine since, except for when I've accidentally been exposed to dairy or gluten. My GI symptoms completely went away. My asthma went away, which I'd had at that point for over a decade. It was so revolutionary for me that I became a zealot. And I first of all became completely obsessed with the science and wanted to read absolutely everything I could. But I also was so enthusiastic about it that I found myself in these very like inappropriate situations where I was like trying to tell the woman cutting my hair that the bagel she ate for breakfast was going to kill her. Like it was not cool in any regard. And so after about 2 months, I hit two decisions at the same time, which was that my family really needed to start doing this with me, and that I really needed an outlet. And on a Thursday evening in early November, I think it was November 1st, I turned to my husband. I said, what do you think about the idea of me starting a blog? And he was like, that sounds great. He was basically the main person who received most of my enthusiastic ramblings at the time.
It's always the way.
And so he was super supportive. So that Sunday, I did some research and figured out what my handle would be. And I underestimated at the time how my scientific background would come into play in my writing. And I really thought that I was going to be blogging as the stay-at-home mom version of me rather than the scientist version of me. And over even just a few months, that really became obvious that the thing that I have to offer this community is not just this experience of understanding how science is performed and being able to read papers and understand their merits and their value and how to form that bigger picture from a lot of small pieces, but also because I went from a physics undergrad to a physiology lab PhD, I changed fields between my PhD and my first postdoctoral research position and between my first and my second postdoctoral research position. So I had spent so much time teaching myself these other fields, teaching myself the language and the jargon, that I knew how to communicate these complex topics to a person who doesn't know that a leukocyte is a white blood cell. Like it, and I don't have that, the snobbiness around the vocabulary that you often find in these professionals, and not, it's more that they're so steeped in that lexicon that they don't necessarily know how to back out of it.
Yeah.
But I was able to take that experience and apply it to writing while respecting my audience and not wanting to dumb things down, not wanting to simplify concepts, but just take the time to explain all of the relevant science that answers this question in a way that's accessible. And so my website's become so much more than what I initially anticipated it would be. But really driven by not being able to shut off nerd. That's just me. That's me all the time. But also this, again, sort of like inherent attraction to helping people, and this personal experience that, created this niche for me where I really felt like it was my responsibility to make this information more approachable for people, because it was information that if I'd had 20 years earlier, it would have completely changed the trajectory of my life.
Right. Absolutely. So let me ask a question I think is probably going to take us to our next section. What was the difference between the low carb diet you're on and your more paleo diet that was triggering the autoimmune issues that you're having?
I think it was a few different things. So, okay. I think it was really this collection of things. So I was on what would have been a very typical low carb diet, sort of Atkins-esque. Right. So it was not strictly gluten-free. I was using things like soy sauce in cooking. And I know now that I'm extremely sensitive to gluten. Okay. It embraced dairy, right? So right. Cheese is very common. Jeez. And I know now that I'm extremely sensitive to dairy. And also was fairly phobic of really healthy carbohydrates that we know now provide a lot of valuable nutrients, that we know now really support a gut microbiome. So things like fruit, like starchy root vegetables, right? Roots and tubers. And so it was that sort of combination, I think, of having some food toxins in my diet that are particularly problematic for my body, while also missing out on what I would, put under the umbrella of the sort of the nutrient density piece of actually choosing foods based on the nutrients they contain, like vitamins and minerals and healthy fats and essential amino acids, right? Those things are really important to get sufficient of to support immune health and hormone health and gut health. And that wasn't on my radar. I came from, I think, what a lot of people who battle with their weight come from, your first diet thing that you're introduced to is the idea of calories, right? Too many
Right.
calories bad, cut the calories good, right? That very simplistic view of energy in, energy out. And then that like one layer on top of that of carbohydrates. But without, I think, where I really want to take that conversation for the public is carbohydrate quality, not carbohydrate quantity. So I think my low carb diet really helped because it took out all the junk food, the food that
Right.
you overeat. It took out the empty carbs, the high sugar. But I think that it was flawed in the absence of these healthy carbs that, whole food carbs, fruit and root vegetables that really help to improve health while still avoiding these manufactured foods that trigger overeating and all kinds of other problems.
One part of your story that really resonates with me because I changed my diet. I lost 200 pounds and fixed 100 things that were wrong with me. Didn't fix my high blood pressure. Nothing I've done has fixed my high blood pressure. Like I can't. I'm on. If I don't take any medications at all, my blood pressure is like 160 over 120.
Wow.
If I'm taking 3 very stout medications, and it's only dropping at 20 points from that. And it's totally maddening. Like it's crazy making. How many things I can fix with diet, but I can't fix this one thing. So I totally understand that frustration of having fixed a lot of things, but can't fix the one or two big things that you think would have just come along with all the other stuff. Yeah.
On paper, it should work. Yeah.
Yeah. It seems to, because, the doctor never said, doctor always said, if you lose weight, your blood pressure will go down. The idea that if you lose weight, your blood pressure won't go down. That was never, no one ever said that. That
Right.
Didn't seem like it was a possibility. Well, anyway, but I don't know if you've developed it or for what, maybe we can go into that, this AIP protocol. And I think that this is probably a very important, idea of trying to figure out, what can you eat? Like what foods go along with your body? Can you, first of all, talk to us about the history of that? Is that something that you came up with? Is it something you read somewhere else or what?
I did not invent the Ottoman Protocol, but what I did do was sort of develop it. So I took something that was fairly bare bones and made it much more robust and also popularized it just by writing about the science behind it. So I don't want to take credit for it because it was not my original idea, but it certainly wouldn't exist as it is now without my work in this field.
Okay.
So the Ottoman Protocol was originally something that was crafted between Rob Wolf and Professor Lauren Cordain. Rob's mom has autoimmune disease. So they were just, Rob used to he was a graduate student in Professor Cordain's lab. And so they were emailing each other back and forth and basically looking at the Paleo template, which is, both of their thing,
Right.
and trying to figure out what potentially additional triggering foods were still in paleo that might be problematic for autoimmune disease. And so there was about 2/3 of a page in the Paleo Solution, which was Rob's first book. That was, I believe it was called The Autoimmune Caveat. So it was like this additional, here's some additional foods to eliminate. And then Professor Cordain had a chapter in the Paleo Answer, which was his second book, second science book. I don't know if, I think a cookbook came in there somewhere. That was, here's some additional foods to avoid. And the lists were not the same, which I think is really interesting. So there were a couple of websites at the time that had sort of combined these, and somebody somewhere coined it the Autoimmune Protocol. And what happened for me in my sort of first 4 months of following a paleo diet was I had these really amazing, what felt like miraculous improvements in my health that really helped me to buy into the power of diet and lifestyle for health and healing. But I didn't have it wasn't like everything got all the way better. So I was still having, like, my eczema and acne went away, my psoriasis went away, but my lichen planus did not. Okay, so like, what do I need to do? So I was so in the weeds in terms of reading the science and really trying to wrap my head around this entire picture. So I, somewhere in there, learned for the first time that my skin conditions were autoimmune in nature. No medical professional had mentioned that to me previously. And that brought me to the Autoimmune Protocol. And I was at this point very, very receptive, and looked at these additional, right? They're basically like, and cut out all these other foods,
Right.
which I really now, especially looking back at my own health journey and the type of resources that are out there, have a very deep concern over how we define diets based on what we don't eat. I think it's leading a lot of people down some very dangerous paths. But that was the path I was on at the time. But also that was right when Dr. Terry Wall's TEDx Iowa City talk went viral. Right. And her talk was all about nutrient density for mitochondrial health in multiple sclerosis, which, I mean, she got out of her wheelchair just by eating a lot of vegetables and seafood, which is absolutely amazing.
Right.
And so as I was looking at this list of foods to avoid, I was also looking at this list of foods to eat more of, thanks to Dr. Walls. And I ended up, even from the beginning of I started the Autoimmune Protocol as a New Year's resolution 4 months after starting Paleo. So I started Paleo on August 31st, 2011, and I started the AIP January 1st, 2012. And right from the beginning, this vegetable focus started seeping in. Very shortly after that, I found my local farmer's market, which I didn't even know was there, and found farmers who couldn't even sell organ meat. They would give it to me for free. So I started working on this like snout to tail consumption. And that was when my health just went, it took that initial journey, which was so amazing that I was inspired to start a website, and just accelerated it rapidly. And so I ended up really digging into, well, why, what is behind this list of additional foods to avoid, but also what do I need to eat? What does the immune system need to regulate itself? And I started at the same time recognizing that I would feel so much better on a morning after I'd gone to bed early. So wait, how does sleep fit into the system? How does stress and activity fit into the system? And it really was inspired by me trying to really just getting into the weeds in terms of understanding my health. But I've always been very interested in understanding the difference between something that is specific to me versus something that's generally applicable. And what I write about is always what's generally applicable. So what does the science tell me, is the case here for everyone with autoimmune disease, right? So vitamin D deficiency, really, really bad thing. Really, really important to get our vitamin D levels into a normal range. Well, now then understanding myself, can I address my own vitamin D deficiency with more seafood and more time out in the sun? Nope. Need to move to supplements. What amount do I need? So I don't make a recommendation based on what amount of vitamin D I need on a daily basis in order to keep my levels, because that's going to be individual. But I think it's important to create the educational resources around the importance of vitamin D for immune regulation, hormone regulation, the gut microbiome. Like vitamin D is really fundamental. Well, all of the essential nutrients are really fundamental. But that became, for me, it became so exciting to really dig into that science and write about it. And I ended up getting the opportunity 10 months after I started my blog. I was approached by 2 different publishing houses a week and a half apart from each other. And I didn't start a blog thinking that would become my career, that I would write a book. I realized that's the stereotypical career path that aspiring bloggers have in mind. But for me, it was always, I call it my accidental career, because I was just passionate about creating those resources for people. But that was a really empowering moment and helped me understand the value of my voice. And so I decided that here's this thing that people need to understand, which is that, food and lifestyle are impacting immune health, and the immune system not regulating itself is relevant to every chronic illness, but it's of course what's driving autoimmune disease. And so I will write a book about the Autoimmune Protocol. And that was my first book, The Paleo Approach.
That's what did it, huh? Yeah. You mentioned vitamin D. That's one of those questions I've always had is vitamin D important because vitamin D is important, or is it important because it's a it's a stand-in for, the other things that you're doing that is raising your vitamin D. Like, if someone who has high vitamin D, is it because they're eating usually high quality food and they're spending enough time outside, usually doing exercise? Is that why vitamin D is important? Or, should you do you get the same benefits from supplements? You mentioned supplements. Is that something you have some understanding of?
Yeah. So with vitamin D specifically, I would back up and say that with every nutrient other than vitamin D, I would always recommend food sources over supplements. And that's because when you consume the nutrients in a whole food, you are not just getting usually the most absorbable form, the form that's most easily used by your body, but you're also getting the synergistic nutrients. So it's always vastly preferable to get nutrients from food over supplements. Vitamin D is a bit of an exception because we don't typically get enough from food, even when we're eating a lot of mushrooms and seafood. It's really hard to get enough. We're supposed to make it. Our bodies make it in response to UV radiation from the sun, from cholesterol in our skin. And there are some situations where that synthesis is inhibited. So being obese means we make less vitamin D, and vitamin D deficiency increases risk of obesity. So that's an awesome snowball of bad. There's some genes that will inhibit vitamin D synthesis. There's some interesting nutrient deficiencies. So the vitamin D receptor is a zinc-based molecule. So zinc deficiency can also drive vitamin D deficiency. So there's a variety of different things that can go along that can basically mean that even if we're spending a lot of time outside, which most of us are not spending anywhere near enough time outside,
right,
that we just can't make the amount of vitamin D that a normal healthy person would make. So in that case, because vitamin D, right? So being inflamed reduces your vitamin D synthesis. Vitamin D deficiency drives inflammation, right? So it is these sort of like feedback loops, right? Both things are feeding each other. And so the only real good solution there is to supplement with vitamin D, and people need vastly different amounts of vitamin D to bring their levels to normal. So I always recommend test, supplement, retest, and retest every 3 to 4 months. What dose of vitamin D you need in the summer might be different than what you need in the winter. Vitamin D has about a 2 to 3 month lifespan. So testing on that schedule will really help you dial in how much vitamin D you need. And it may be a moving target for a couple of years before it kind of settles down. But that being said, there are benefits to being outside that getting your vitamin D levels into the normal range can't replicate. Okay. So there is a bunch of science, like gut microbiome science. I'm writing a gut microbiome book, so I'm just nerd out about gut bacteria all the time. But it's a really good example of benefits we get from being outside in the sun that you can't replicate with vitamin D. So our gut microbiome responds to both our vitamin D levels and our sun exposure. And so it's important to dial in our levels and get those into a normal range, but it's not a pill that replicates the benefits of being outside.
Okay. So go outside.
Yeah.
Take a pill if you need it. Okay. Perfect. Yeah. Can you walk us through, like, you got somebody who has some of these diseases maybe that you had. What are the basics of the AIP protocol? What is it they should be doing?
So the most fundamental aspect of the autoimmune protocol is nutrient density. So it's a high vegetable consumption, lots of seafood, eating snout to tail, not being carb phobic. So root vegetables and fruit are absolutely embraced on the autoimmune protocol. So the number one feature of it is actually getting all of the nutrients that our bodies need to function optimally from food. And as soon as you start looking at our nutrient requirements and what foods supply what nutrients, you kind of end up in this, a diet that looks very much like autoimmune protocol just based on that. But then it goes beyond and it eliminates any foods that have inflammatory compounds in it. So anything that might drive the immune system into overactivity. And it basically eliminates all of the possible culprits. Like, not all of the foods eliminated are going to be a problem for every person, but we just kind of do a better safe than sorry approach. Let's cut out everything that might be a problem. And then once we're feeling better, we experiment on ourselves and start to what's called reintroductions or challenges. We start to test our own individual tolerance to those foods. And tolerance generally improves as people go on their healing journey. So they might try eggs, for example, early on, and it causes symptoms. They try them again 6 months later, and it's great. And that's because gut health is really an important aspect of how our bodies respond to foods. And it's a very dynamic, food sensitivity is a very dynamic system that's constantly changing. So it's both, the idea is to flood the body with nutrients, to eliminate anything that might be driving inflammation, negatively impacting gut health, driving hormone imbalances in any kind of way, get those, right, detox those out. And then it's holistic. So it also incorporates a focus on getting enough sleep, on incorporating movement throughout the day, but avoiding overtraining, right? So hitting that beautiful U-shaped curve with exercise where we're getting all the benefits without the detriments of either being sedentary or being a marathoner. And then managing stress and sort of embracing things like nature time and social connections, which are all like really important inputs into how the immune system is functioning.
The initial diet where it's stripped down from everything that could cause a reaction, is that basically just meat and leafy greens, or what does that look like?
No, it's so it would be embracing as much diversity of vegetables as possible. So I actually think of vegetables, like families of vegetables, as their own food groups. So mushrooms are their own food group. Leafy greens are their own food group. The cabbage family, cruciferous vegetables, are their own food group. Roots and tubers and winter squash I'd put into another food group. Fruit is, endorsed. I'd put berries in a food group, apple family in a food group, citrus in a food group, melons in a food group. And actually, we know that it's really important to hit as many of those different sort of vegetable and fruit families on a daily basis as possible and try to hit all of them over a 2 to 3 day rotation for the sake of the gut microbiome. So I would say a typical plate is 2/3 to 3/4 covered in a variety of different vegetables. I try to hit 20 to 30 different fruits and vegetables over the course of a week. And obviously, I'm buying like a whole bunch of kale and a whole bundle of asparagus. So I'm hitting them several times in that week. And then that 1/4 to 1/3 is a high quality protein or seafood, eating snout to tail. And then of course, looking at healthy fats like, extra virgin olive oil, avocado oil, healthy animal fats. So like tallow from grass-fed beef or lard from pastured porks. So making sure that the fats that we're cooking in are nutrient dense, healthy, not oxidized fats. And that's pretty much it. I mean, there is some room for treats. There are some wheat-based flour substitutes that can work on the Ottoman Protocol, especially like cassava flour, which is actually really easy to cook with. And so it's not it can seem like a lot for people coming in, right? So it depends on where you're coming from to look at this list of foods to avoid, and how I'm going to structure my plates can seem very, very different. But I like to liken it to when we first move out of the house and all of a sudden we have to buy our own groceries and cook them and do it on a budget, right? Like those first few years when we're first on our own, like that's a huge shocker of, wait, I had no idea that food costs this much. I'm burning things. I'm putting things together in a pot that should never have any business being in the same room as each other. And we get through it, right? We learn and we end up in a place where we're at least somewhat competent cooks and we know at least how to buy groceries from the grocery store without going crazy over budget. And so we kind of have to do some of that learning over again. And it's easier the second time because we have the experience of having done it the first time. And once we kind of get through that learning experience, and especially if you're eating manufactured foods, like so if you're coming from a place where there's still some junk foods in your diet, the flavor profile aspect can be a real challenge because you're eating foods that have an exaggerated reward response in your brain and actually drive food addiction.
Right.
You really need to get those out before you can appreciate the flavors of the high quality food you're eating that's supporting health. But for most people, you kind of get through this learning curve, and then all of a sudden it's just the way you eat. Like it's just, it's fine. We all find what's my favorite food to cook on the night that I get home late after taking the kids to soccer practice, or what's my favorite thing to have on hand for breakfast so that I can eat it in the car, as I'm running out the door. We each have our own preferences and schedule challenges. So once we kind of go through that troubleshooting for ourselves, how do I make this fit into my life instead of making my life fit into this diet? Right. Then it just becomes the thing that we do.
Are you concerned at all with things like these so-called anti-nutrients, things like oxalates and lectins and phytates and even fructose in the fruit? Is that something that you're concerned about?
Yes and no. So it's really context dependent, and it's really dependent on the anti-nutrient in question. So if we're talking about something like agglutinins or prolamins in grains, then yes, I'm quite concerned with those because they drive gut dysbiosis. So they feed, for example, E. coli in the gut. They are adjuvants, so they ramp up antibody production by the immune system. So they have a variety of effects on human health that are problematic. Phytates in high quantities can be problematic for gut health, but in moderate quantities, like you're getting from most fruits and vegetables, our gut bacteria actually are able to process a lot of that. Okay. Oxalates, right? True oxalate sensitivity is a 1 in 5 million occurrence. Most of what people are blaming oxalates on is usually something else like salicylates or histamine intolerance. And again, our gut bacteria are really good at liberating minerals from oxalates in order for us to absorb it. So in the context of a nutrient-dense diet that supports gut microbiome health, some of the things that have kind of taken on this life of their own on the internet as these horrible anti-nutrients and why we should never eat spinach, a lot of those concerns are really misplaced.
What are your views on something like the carnivore diet?
I have very serious concerns about the carnivore diet. It is a diet that does not provide some of the nutrients that we know are fundamental to health. And it has not been validated in the scientific literature at all. There was one guy who did it for a year in, I think, the 20s. And the whole conclusion of that study was, oh, it's pretty cool he didn't get scurvy. Like, that was the measurements they were making at that time were so limited compared to our ability to evaluate how that would impact health now. And he probably didn't get scurvy because he was eating things like adrenal glands, which are really high in vitamin C, which is not how people following the carnivore diet now are. They're just eating T-bone steak and
ribeyes.
Yeah. And so I really have deep concerns over the long-term health impacts of following a diet like that. It's not enough fiber or starch for the gut microbiome. And that's a really big thing. Also, I would put carnivore and keto into the same category as not recognizing that insulin is a superhormone and it has roles in the human body that go beyond glucose metabolism. Like, yes, we want to regulate blood glucose. Insulin sensitivity is a great thing, but that doesn't mean we want to make insulin zero, because insulin does all of these really important things. It regulates thyroid health, it regulates hormone health, it regulates regulates some neurotransmitters, so it regulates some cognition, memory type effects. It's regulating bone mineralization, protein synthesis in muscles. And so we're seeing, if you dig into the literature on keto, there's, again, no literature on carnivore, but if you dig into the literature on keto and start looking at adverse reactions in these papers, you see, there's a paper published, I think it was late 2017, that one of the only papers to measure thyroid health in, it was epileptic adolescents on a keto diet. And 1 in 6 of the kids became hypothyroid, requiring levothyroxine supplementation within 6 months of keto. And I think that if you when you really dig into that literature and look at adverse effects, you see the problems caused by not enough insulin for all of these other normal jobs that insulin would do.
Well, I mean, I know that the body will put out a small amount of insulin just when you stretch the stomach, from eating. You don't
Mhm.
think that would be enough to
Well,
things?
so keto has this additional effect where you're producing a lot less insulin than you normally would with. So there is, right, there's what's called pre-cephalatic insulin release, which is basically I ate something, I tasted food, my pancreas produces insulin in anticipation of blood sugar going up. So there is an effect of some stimulus to insulin production, but certainly not the same as if we were actually eating carbohydrates. But at the same time as that high fat of a diet increases what are called free fatty acids in the blood, and that causes insulin resistance. So the classic retort from somebody in the keto community is, it doesn't matter if you're insulin resistant if you're not eating any carbs, right? Like, who cares? Because I'm never going to have enough sugar in my body to make that worthwhile. But that comes from this very simplistic view of insulin being just the thing that shuttles glucose into a cell, and not a really essential signaling hormone that controls a whole variety of other systems. So when you look at it from this, like, all the things that insulin does, well, the combination of not producing very much insulin and insulin resistance is why you see the exact same adverse reactions to keto as you do in type 2 diabetes.
Like what? Like what are the adverse effects that you're seeing from a ketogenic person that you would see in a type 2 diabetic?
So you're seeing a much higher risk of hypothyroidism, which you see
Okay.
in both conditions. You see a loss of lean muscle mass. So there's been a collection of studies now that have looked at keto versus protein matched, calorie matched, but higher carbohydrate, lower fat diets for weight loss. And there's more of a protein sparing effect in the non-ketogenic diet than in keto. So you're actually losing more lean muscle mass than if you were following a more balanced macronutrient approach. And of course, our lean mass is elevating our basal metabolic rate. There's a lot of metabolic regulation that's happening from muscle, and having more muscle is one of the best things we can do to improve our chances of maintaining lost weight. In children, there's loss of bone mineral density. That hasn't been replicated in adults, but potentially because the studies haven't been long enough, our bone turnover rate is much slower than children. So it would take a longer time to see if a ketogenic diet would cause osteopenia or osteoporosis in adults. That's still an open question. There's a bunch of studies looking at the cognitive effects of ketogenic diets, showing that people are not as able to solve problems. So anything requiring sort of higher order thinking, faster memory retrieval, a cognitive flexibility, their performance is worse on a ketogenic diet than before that same person goes on a ketogenic diet. And then the hormone effects are really interesting because right now the studies are all over the map. It's really unclear. It's really difficult to say, you can take a group of male athletes on keto and all of their testosterone goes up, and then another group of male athletes that should be the same and all of their testosterone goes down. So there's not a really clear pattern, other than you could say that keto probably affects hormones, and it may or may not be a good thing depending on where you're starting and who you are and what you're doing. And so I think, I think even a bigger concern is right at the end of 2018 and the first half of 2019, there was this huge influx of papers looking at the effects on the gut microbiome from ketogenic diets, showing loss of really key probiotic species, bifidobacterium, which is a necessary resident of any healthy gut, rosburria, which is also low levels of rosburria are linked to increased risk of chronic disease, and then increases in some potentially problematic strains that are linked with like inflammatory bowel disease. So I think one of the things that really concerns me right now about how keto has taken on this amazing life as a weight loss diet is that the educational resources that are created for the community on keto are based on this really, I think criminally selective reading of the science, where people are not being told about the potential detrimental side effects. And when you look at studies that actually report adverse reactions, the adverse reaction rates in those studies are anywhere between 10% and 100% of people. Like, that's it's just, I don't want to take away from the therapeutic potential for something like epilepsy or multiple sclerosis, even like Alzheimer's if you're not ApoE4, but there's this whole list of like health problems that keto can cause that people are not aware of until they're faced with a health problem. Keto should never be done without close medical supervision. And, especially when you're talking about somebody who is looking for a solution for weight loss, which I think is the community that keto is trying to appeal to now. There are healthy ways to lose weight, maximize your ability to keep it off, and it's not keto. Like there's other alternatives out there, and I think that it's really it's really concerning to me to see so much marketing that's really predatory marketing, pushing keto and like exogenous ketone supplements, right? Like it's become a huge supplement industry around the ketogenic diet as well, when the science would say that the safety profile is not great.
Yeah, the keto supplements always kind of crack me up a little bit, because it's like, you can, all the benefits of a ketogenic diet from a pill. How are you? It doesn't even make sense, especially when the main benefit you're trying to go for is weight loss. What is that going to do for you?
What's fascinating to me about this is, first of all, there's no human studies on exogenous ketones,
right?
Or very, very few, right? And certainly not in like weight loss. They're all in performance.
Yeah, exactly.
And if you look at, so a flexible metabolism will dip in and out of ketosis. So in the morning, I'm in ketosis because I haven't eaten in 14 hours.
Right.
In between meals, you're probably dipping into ketosis. So a flexible metabolism will use carbs after a meal when they're available. And when the carbs run out, it will start metabolizing fat and you'll make ketone bodies. So a flexible metabolism goes in and out. But at no point in a normal metabolism are you metabolizing carbs and fat at the same time.
Right.
You metabolize carbs when they're there and fats when the carbs aren't there. So what you're doing with exogenous ketones is you're basically making your mitochondria metabolize both simultaneously. So you're basically saying that you just ate a banana, but here's your exogenous ketones. So you've got both. We don't know if that's good or bad. Like maybe it's awesome. Maybe it's like, woohoo, here's this amazing thing that, if only cavemen had this, the Neanderthals would have survived. I don't know. But that's the problem. We don't know. We don't know what the implications are to our health of forcing two different kinds of metabolism that normally happen separately to happen at the same time.
What about the claim that most of these studies that we're getting that show detrimental effects of the ketogenic diet, these are studies that are being done on, sorry, my video went away. These are studies that are being done on sick children. A lot of them are like epileptic children, and the way that they're inducing a ketogenic diet is usually with shakes. It's not with real food. In fact, I know for a fact one study for sure showed a selenium deficiency because they were feeding them shakes that didn't have selenium in them. And so what about this claim that that's why these particular studies were showing detrimental effects of keto, is because the studies themselves were not done well, that these things wouldn't happen with a real food ketogenic diet?
There's certainly a very detailed conversation to have around the applicability of the results of some of these studies to the general population. But the lumping these hundreds of studies that have shown adverse reactions into this one category of, oh yes, and we don't listen to this because it's not applicable to us, is a selective reading of the science to look for, it's basically confirmation bias. It's looking for only the science that supports my job, right? My source of income, and a complete dismissal of some very relevant science, because they're not all on shakes. There are a number of studies where these kids are on food sources. There's some of these epileptic kids with refractory epilepsy, they're a more sensitive population, but there's deaths. They've died.
Yeah.
There's multiple studies with reported deaths. Okay, well maybe that the death might be, that might not actually happen in the average person. the thing is you're saying that this is a sensitive population. So they're not resilient to the negative effects of keto. It's a huge leap of logic to say that the average person who's doing keto is going to be resilient, is not going to have any effect. I mean, so you dive into the mechanisms behind those adverse reactions, that's happening in everybody. Like, yes, maybe it's not going to kill you. Maybe you're not going to have a heart attack, but that's very different than saying it's irrelevant to you. It's not normally the robust, healthy person who's following keto. Like maybe these athletes who are seeking that, 0.05% performance boost, but somebody who's following keto because they want to lose weight, they might be overweight because they already have undiagnosed hypothyroidism, and keto is going to tank their thyroid even more. It's not, you can't tell me that the science in sick people is irrelevant when you are promoting something to a different group of sick people.
Okay.
I'm getting really worked up, aren't I?
No, that's fine. In fact, you should only do videos because you have one of the most animated faces I've ever seen in my life. So it's great.
So everyone listening to the audio, go to YouTube right now.
it's very enjoyable. So this is important. You mentioned metabolic flexibility. So you're not opposed to ketosis. From time to time, you're opposed to being in it as a permanent state of whatever.
I'm opposed to making food selection that is inherently nutrient deficient, that inherently omits nutrients that are fundamental for the gut microbiome.
Fiber being the main one, because that's the one that everyone focuses on, correct?
Fiber, yeah. So what's really interesting is there was a paper published like 4 weeks ago now, that looked at a low-carb paleo diet and did very similar microbiome analysis to the couple of papers that were produced earlier this year looking at keto, and actually showed some similar impact on the gut microbiome, even though they were eating like 29 grams of fiber a day, which on paper looks great. And so it's interesting because and I can nerd out about the gut microbiome for hours. I've been deep into the weeds on microbiome research for a couple of years now. But the composition of the gut microbiome it's not just about fiber. So it's also about fiber diversity. There's also a really strong impact of starch on the gut microbiome, which is why probably low carb paleo was also not sufficient to support a healthy gut microbiome. We probably need to be eating more fruit and more root vegetables. Protein quality is also a really big impact, and fat. So our gut microbiomes don't like high saturated fat intake. And while you can, right, there are some people doing these sort of vegan keto or Mediterranean keto. There are these variations of it that are lower saturated fat and higher monounsaturated fat. And there's definitely some unanswered questions about whether or not that addresses all of the issues with keto. Probably not, but it may address some. So I think there's this tendency to go like, oh, but I eat my 40 cups of spinach a day on keto, so I'm getting enough fiber, so I must be fine. But the research just from the last month is starting to paint a picture of, no, a healthy gut microbiome really does need root vegetables. It really does need the type of fermentable fibers that are in fruit. It really does need lower fat intake. And so I think it's more complex than just figuring out a way of getting enough fiber on keto.
Okay. Yeah. And so what are some of the other nutrient deficiencies you're seeing from a ketogenic diet, or that you're afraid of, that you're concerned with?
Well, I think the ones that the literature has highlighted, like you mentioned, selenium deficiency, which could be addressed with
a couple of Brazil nuts,
right? Some oysters, right? Some seafood. There's some other mineral deficiencies like copper deficiency. And again, like those are ones that you can plan. One of the things that I'm concerned about is phytonutrient deficiency. And this is a tough one because we have not, and this is the royal we of like the scientific community, have not been able to establish phytonutrients as an essential nutrient because deficiency is so, like true deficiency is so rare. Like all of the nutrients that are diagnosed as or determined as essential are because of examples of deficiency disease, right? Like scurvy if you don't get enough vitamin C, rickets if you don't have enough vitamin D. So if you have severe deficiency, there's this disease of deficiency. And nutrients that are labeled as non-essential are the ones where you basically can't create that situation, so you can't identify a disease of deficiency. But saying it's not essential doesn't mean it's not super important for health. And we've got this huge amount of scientific literature now, like tens of thousands of studies showing that phytonutrients, right? So all of these antioxidant, right, polyphenols in fruits and vegetables and nuts and seeds reduce risk of cancer, reduce risk of obesity, reduce risk of diabetes, reduce risk of autoimmune disease, right? They're important for immune function. They're important for the gut microbiome. They're important for neurological function. And I think the fact that they're labeled as non-essential is a problem because that makes it sound like we don't really need them when we do. And I think that, my read of the scientific literature points much closer to a sort of plant-based diet, not the plant-based diet, but a diet that is overabundant in a variety of fruits and vegetables. And when I compare that the case for that type of dietary strategy with keto or carnivore, where you're basically saying like, we'll just cut out all of the foods that supply those nutrients, that makes me very concerned because I think we're looking at something where the true negative impact might not show up for years, but that when it does show up, it's going to be really scary.
Yeah. So this has been a fascinating interview so far. I want to make sure I value your time because I know I promised I'd get you out of here in about 15 minutes.
We should end on a really boring note.
Yes.
Really
no, it was good. It was good. And I didn't even get to ask you about sweeteners, which is that was my pocket question over here. Just in case
the quick answer is I don't like any of them.
You don't like any of them, yeah? Okay, that's fine. Let's just go right to the end. If my listeners would like to find out more about you, follow you on social media, do all of that good stuff, where can they do all of that?
So my website is thepaleomom.com, and from there you can link to my podcast, my social media sites, my online courses, my books. But also if you're interested in digging more into like my approach to paleo, my approach to the Ottoman Protocol, that very like contemporary science approach, I have 2 free guides that you can go grab at thepaleomom.com/free-gift. So it's free-gift. And those will give you like a really good, very comprehensive overview into what I would call standard paleo. So like paleo without layering on additional dietary priorities on top of it, as well as the Ottoman Protocol, and start to explore the types of things that we've been talking about, right? Like nutrient density and gut microbiome and hormone health and immune health. And that really infuses everything that I talk about.
That's good. Is there existing out there right now somewhere? Is there a podcast or a video or something where you're debating, say, a keto person, somebody who's really into the ketogenic diet, where you're going back and forth? Because I think that would be very interesting.
No, that doesn't exist. And I will tell you why. So I have done, there are videos out there that are easy to get a hold of that are me talking about the science behind adverse reactions to keto. Sure. I also have articles on my site that go into it into exquisite detail with all of the references, along with sort of discussing the applicability aspects. But my feeling is a constructive debate requires logic and reason and being open to contradictory information. And I'm not interested in having a debate with someone who is not open to integrating new information into their belief system.
every once in a while you get one of those that's really good.
And I've had some personal conversations with researchers in keto about some of these aspects. But in terms of the public face of keto, that it would just be a yelling match, and that's not going to benefit anybody.
Oh yeah, yeah, maybe. Joe Rogan's had a few dietary ones and some of them have been like, I love the one with Chris Kresser and Joel Kahn. It was so good, and it was so informative at the end of it. And then he had the one with Tobbs and the other guy, and I can't even think of his name. I could see his face. That was, I mean, it was a train wreck. It was hard to even comfortably listen to the whole debate from start to finish. So I know it can be.
You need everyone within a debate needs to go in respecting everybody on in that room or on that stage,
right.
And needs to go in understanding the other point of view, the other side,
yeah,
in order to be able to have a constructive conversation. And I think that the same problems that we're seeing with tribalism in politics is the same thing that we're seeing within health conscious communities, where people are only seeking the information that confirms their beliefs and aren't necessarily open to new information that might contradict those beliefs. And I think, for me as a scientist, right, scientists love new information that challenges what we thought was true. Like, that is what scientists live for. And so my entire training and perspective, I'm trained to look at contradictory information and find that exciting. Yeah. But I find myself in these conversations where the person I'm talking with looks at that same information and wants to figure out why it's, a bad study that that it's not relevant. And that's just a fundamental difference in approach, but one that I think makes the difference between being able to continue to expand human knowledge and personal growth and be able to make a bigger impact while staying current and reflecting the scientific research versus stagnation that will eventually lead to irrelevance.
All right. Okay. Well, I appreciate you answering that question. All right, guys, we're going to put links to all of everything that she just mentioned there in the show notes. You can find that at mysugarfreejourney.com/podcast. So Sarah, thank you so much for coming on. This was such an informative interview.
Oh, thank you so much again for having me.
All right, guys, we'll be right back with a little more information.